Around 4 years ago, I had an idea. A small seed of a game concept that particularly stood out to me amongst a sea of my generally mediocre ideas. I had just reached the final year of my games degree, and I was very eager to start flexing the game design knowledge I developed in my classes, but I never really took the leap to finally start developing it and put the idea into practice. But 4 years is a pretty long time, and that initial seed of a game concept definitely fell to the wayside. Since then, I've made and released a game entirely on my own, and I've learnt quite a bit from it. Most notably, I've learnt that when I'm working on one project, my mind wanders like crazy and will develop and design an entirely different game concept with pretty much no remorse for my existing task. So, in the almost 1 year development time of my game Dial-In, the idea of this game kept coming back to me over and over again, slowly mutating and growing, reaching levels of scope creep that are probably unreasonable for a project that hadn't even been written pen to paper. I figured now that I'm free to finally work on it, it'd be smart to document and record my progress as a way to look back on when and how I got to where I am. So, a little bit of background. One of the things I've always liked about games is their ability to capture a feeling. And this isn't necessarily the only reason I got into game development in the first place, but it's definitely one of the reasons I dug deeper into it. Games have an almost active ability to make the player feel a certain way through an incredibly interactive medium, giving way to emotions that are, to my knowledge, almost impossible to capture in other mediums. Some of these feelings are positive, like the ability to be analytic when playing strategy games like Civilization, or the more reactive humor that comes from clever writing and predicting how the player will act in games like the Stanley Parable. But one particular feeling that I have a probably unhealthy relationship with are surprisingly the negative feelings, like frustration or hopelessness, that is usually rewarded with a sense of release and pleasure when a specific task is completed. A really well-known series that would fit this description would be something like the Dark Souls series, or if you're looking in the indie space, something like Super Meat Boy, or Binding of Isaac, or Hotline Miami. Which brings us to the main inspiration and reference to what I'll be working on. Hotline Miami always stuck out to me as a wholly positive experience. The game is no doubt difficult, even frustrating at times, and you have to use every edge you can get to beat every level the game throws at you. But it's also very deliberate and clever about how it lays out these challenges, and when you finally do overcome a particular level that's got you dying on repeat, it's a pretty amazing feeling. So while my experience isn't universal, one thing I did feel while playing the game is that there is no actual incentive to dive right into the carnage. In fact, due to the nature of the instant death mechanic in the game, you're almost encouraged to avoid it and to think through your moves carefully whenever you aren't actively being hunted in the game, which can really lead to pauses of downtime in what's meant to be a game of intensity. And this isn't exclusive to this game. I've seen several games in the same sort of space where this concept of a rampage is sort of coveted. But then I'll see people playing it and they'll tend to hang back, taking a more reserved and cautious approach to the carnage that feels sort of tonally mismatched with what the game is aiming for. That's where the main concept of my game stems from. How can I force the player to dive into the combat? How can I capture that sense of carnage, like a John Wick film, where every step of the way he's in the action, taking guys out left, right, and center, taking the occasional blow, but powering through it? My solution was pretty simple. Your life is timed, and if you don't kill the next goon in time, you will just die. Almost a combo meter of sorts that constantly ticks down and resets every time you kill an enemy. The ultimate goal being that you can chain enemies and knock them out with a carefully executed sequence of attacks. But enough design work for now. If there's one thing I've learned from my last game dev experience, is that the number one step of game dev after designing a concept. So I guess the second step of game dev is to prototype. There are a couple more ideas I've got sitting on the back burner, but until I have a more solid base to work with, they are pretty much meaningless to go over. One thing I should establish sooner rather than later, I've already spent a decent amount of time prototyping this still untitled project. So the first few devlogs are mainly going to be covering the progress I've made while showing whatever I decided to record of it at the time. So with that in mind, the first step in any project like this is to get a character controller together. Now, since the main game I'm modeling this project after is obviously Hotline Miami, the idea is eventually it'll turn into its own thing through both the iterative process, cutting and changing things according to what I feel is appropriate for the game loop I'm targeting, and by implementing my own mechanics through things like the combo meter and whatever else I feel is fitting for the game. So, pulling from my reference, I did a bit of research by playing through a chunk of Hotline Miami and getting a feel for what they do and how it controls. So for the player, the control scheme is fairly simple. The player moves around the X and Y axis using the WASD keys, and their head, as I took to calling it during my own development, constantly points in the direction of the cursor. Being such a simple controller, that was fairly straightforward to implement, and while I've had some questionable experiences with Unity's physics systems, I decided for the purposes of this project, just using a dynamic rigid body in this case would serve perfectly fine. With the most basic form of controls in place, I decided the next step was to implement some kind of camera. In our reference game, the camera seems to be locked to extend out a certain distance and sits between the player and where the mouse is pointing, almost using this directional movement as a way of simulating a field of view in a top-down game. More notably though is that when the player holds shift, this camera gets extended further and allows the player to view the area ahead of them without putting themselves at risk of being seen. So I implemented this fairly quickly using Unity's Cinemachine package and placing a camera target, which you can see with the red point between the player and the cursor, and just having a VCam follow it from this point forward. When you hold down shift, this camera focus gets more room to breathe, doubling the distance it can travel and adjusting its relative position between the camera and the mouse from around 50% of the way to 75%, locking at a further distance. So at this point, I did actually come across a bit of an issue with how the camera updates. While motionless, the camera was actually fine, but as the character moved around, the camera would stutter behind them. And I found the solution was pretty simply to change how the VCam updates from updating on every frame to updating on fixed updates. So it updates with the physics system. This came with its own issues a little further down the line, but at this point it achieves what we're kind of looking for here. At this point, while I'm still very early in the stages of prototyping, I just opted to use Unity's default tile mapping system to just lay down some quick foundations to work with. And although I've used in the past for my last game, I never really dug too deeply into manipulating it. And in classic scope creep fashion, I would like to implement some kind of level editor at some point, probably internally at first, and then transition it to an editor accessible to the player. Thank you to anyone who made it to the end of this devlog. If keeping up with updates regarding this game is something that interests you, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And I imagine YouTube will probably notify you whenever a new devlog comes out. We'll probably be looking at the real meat of the game and getting some basic playable controls in there. So again, if that's something that interests you, make sure you keep an eye out for the next devlog.